Unit 2.4.
Oh man, now I gotta act civil.
Exactly. 2.4 is all about the controls that are placed on land other than deed controls. We talked about last week when we talked about encumbrances, we talked about limitations that a grantor might place on a deed. Now we're talking about limitations that would be found in places other than on the most recent deed. Like maybe they were on an older deed in the case of like subdivision regulations or covenants. Or maybe they're not related to the deed at all. Maybe they are limitations that come from the government in some way. So this section is going to all be about the different types of controls that can be on land. I mean, I think it's really important to remind ourselves that it's very hard to come across a piece of land anywhere, really. Now, I don't care how far you go out in the country, in North Carolina, and really maybe even nationally, it's hard to imagine you're going to find a piece of land that is completely unrestricted. I mean, if you think about what that means, completely unrestricted. In fact, I don't think we've got on the limb to say there is no such thing as a piece of land that's completely unrestricted, because even if you're talking about in the middle of the Mojave Desert, you're going to have some type of federal restrictions on that land. You're going to have something that's going to limit what the owner of that land can do with the land in some way. I'm pretty sure even if you own land in the middle of the desert, there is some law that says you can't just go out there and dump toxic waste on the ground. And so that would be a land use control. That would be an example of controlling the way that land is used. But the thing is, when you talk about controlling the way the land is used, those controls come from a lot of different places. And that's what this section deals with, is where are all these controls coming from? What are all the different types of controls?
That's exactly the thing. Whenever we think land use controls, for me personally, I think it probably comes across very broad. And until I heard this over and over and over, I didn't realize exactly what it's saying on this slide right here is that they can be public, they can be private, and who enforces each of those. Like, there's a big distinction between the two, and it is important to understand, not even for the test, but for real life.
That's exactly right. So I use the analogy a lot of, like, think of yourself as like a teenager and you're going out for the night. You have lots of controls limiting what you can do, and some of them come from the government and some of them come from your parents, and you have to follow both. As an example, you can't go out and drive 100 miles an hour. Now, your parents might be upset, but ultimately that's not why, if you're a teenager, you can't go out and drive 100 miles an hour. It's because there's a government control in place. There's a law that says you can't do that. And by the way, if you broke that law, would it be your parents that you would have to answer to, or would it be some government entity like the police or the court system that you'd have to answer to? What do y'all think?
Both.
Government. The government.
But ultimately, the government entity is the one who's really charged with enforcing that, right? Well,
now you might have on. Go ahead. You got it.
But you might also have a rule that says you got to be home by 10 o'clock. Now, let me ask you a question. If you tell your kids they have to be home by 10 o'clock and it's 10:15 and they're not home, and the parents call the police and say, I told my child to be home at 10:15 at 10 and there's 10:15 and they're not here, are the police going to do anything about that?
No.
Because
and that is such a good example.
Because it's not their rule. It's not their law. It's not their job to enforce a private restriction that was placed by that set of parents on that child. And so I think when you think about these land use controls, it's so important to realize that they're just different sources of rules that come from different places. And here's what you got to recognize on the test. Who's going to enforce these rules is not going to always be the same answer, because the rules are not put in place by the same people all the time. And so, Seth, I think that's probably what you were getting at there, which is
Yeah.
it takes a long time, I think, to wrap your brain around. Not all land use controls are created the same. Some come from
Right.
the government, and government is even in itself a big term. It could be local government, it could be federal government, it could be state government, could all have different sets of rules about that piece of land. And then you could have the private restrictions that come from previous owners of that piece of land. And the truth is that the person who owns the land right now has to follow all of these rules. They have to figure out, okay, what are the private restrictions that previous owners have placed on this property? Because I have to follow those. And what are the restrictions that the United States federal government has placed on this property? Because I have to follow those. And what are the restrictions that the state of North Carolina has placed on this property? Because I have to follow those. And what are the restrictions that the town of Cary has placed on this property? Because if I'm in Cary, I got to follow those. So it's just this big long list of like, how many different people can we possibly answer to about this piece of property?
And that's the thing, Travis, it's exactly what I was trying to get at. It's what you try to get at. It's when you think of land use control, it's exactly what Travis said. They are not all created the same. And I don't think that necessarily hits home every single time. Like, you have to realize there's classifications to these, and who enforces them is a huge, highly testable topic within the scope of this chapter. There's probably only like 3 questions
You said
from it, but
you said the magic word right there, test. Right here from the first slide, folks, is probably a test question, except it's not going to be a definitional type test question. What they're going to do on the test is they're going to give you an example of a restriction, and then they're going to ask you, who would you report a violation of that restriction to? Who would you go to? Who would be charged with enforcement? Folks, I cannot stress enough, don't call the police when your kids are 15 minutes late. It's not their job. Don't call the police when your neighbor has their trash can in front of their house if it's the covenants that say they can't have the trash can there. Here's a news flash. The police didn't put the covenants there. The law didn't put the covenants there. The covenants were put there by a previous owner of the property. So the only people that can enforce rules put there by the previous owners are the current owners of that property. And so you have to constantly ask yourself, okay, where did this rule come from? And Elizabeth asked a great question. She said, what happens if these rules conflict with each other? Here's the ugly answer, Elizabeth, and nobody likes this answer. You can't break either one of these rules. And so in some cases, that means that the property owner is really caught between a rock and a hard place. Like as an example, I've seen properties that the covenants on the property said that the property could only be used as a mobile home park. I've seen a property that was what the deed said, and that's what it was used for, a mobile home park. And then the city came through and rezoned the property at a later date, and the new zoning didn't allow for mobile home parks. And so the question becomes, well, if I have a mobile home park, I'm violating the city's governing ordinances. If I don't have a mobile home park, I'm violating the covenants. What do I do? And the answer is nothing. You literally do nothing with that piece of land, because neither one of those rules is more important than the other. They both have to be followed. And that's going to be tested too. That's going to be tested as well. So it's always about enforcement when we talk about these controls on the property. Now, the government's control comes from something known as police power. If you see that phrase on the test, that is just the authority that has been given to your state government by the federal government, to your local government by the state government. So think of power and authority as sort of flowing downhill. The ultimate power on the government side of things is federal law. And that's why when push comes to shove, if there's a conflict between laws, which law do we always follow? If there's a conflict between a local law and a state law, which one would we follow?
The most strict.
The state law.
Oh,
The state law. It's only, and I appreciate where that answer comes from. The most strict.
Thought it was a trick question too.
It's not a trick question. The most strict becomes if it's a conflict between laws or public and private restrictions. But when you look at a conflict, a true conflict between laws, the state law is going to be more important than the local law. And by the way, which one would be more important than the state law?
Federal.
national.
Federal
Federal.
law. So there
Federal.
is this hierarchy of laws, right? And power flows downhill. Well, the states have power because it's been granted by the federal government. The local municipalities have power because it's been granted by the state. And that's what police power is all about. Now, we take care of that with laws because laws generally are unconstitutional if they violate a higher level of authority. So we don't have to worry about conflicts with the laws. Those usually get sorted out by themselves. It's the conflicts between the laws and the private restrictions that we have to worry about. And that's when you have to follow the more strict of the two. But this police power enables the local governments to control what the property is used for. And this word, zoning, this is local control.
And Travis, while you're going over this, I really think it's important, at least this is how my mind works. Whenever you think of public, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think of it almost like a blanket statement. It goes over a wide range of properties rather than just particular ones.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. When you talk about and when you think about public as a word, what that really means is that it is enforced by the government, right? Public land use controls simply come from a government source. And that could be local, that could be federal, that could be, state. There's lots of different layers of, but the idea that you just hit on is huge. Laws are not meant to be targeted at one property. Laws are meant to be targeted at huge groups of people, huge groups of property, and treat everybody the same. And that's a big difference between public land use controls and private land use controls, because the public ones are designed to treat everyone the same. Private ones are meant to only restrict that one piece of property or all of those pieces of property that are in the same subdivision. But public land use controls are supposed to hit everybody equally. So zoning is the most local version of all control. Zoning is the one where we step back and we say, okay, what does my local city have to say about how I use this property? And the truth is, that could be a lot. Now, you do not need, I want you to not freak out and try to memorize everything that's on this slide. You don't need to do that. This is here for reference purposes. These are examples of the kind of things that zoning might limit about a piece of property. See, I think sometimes, and Seth could probably speak to this as well because he's been a student really recently. I think sometimes when we talk about zoning, people think of zoning as only being, oh, that's zoned residential or that's zoned commercial. Like zoning is, it just tells you like in these big, broad sort of, that you can do anything residential on this property, or you can do anything commercial on this property. The truth is zoning is much more specific than that. Zoning gets down to the nitpicky folks. I mean, for example, the building that our office, our physical office location in Raleigh, that area is zoned for a specific type of commercial use that does not allow for retail. It does not allow for restaurant space. It allows for office space, for small office group gatherings, and that's it. You can't go in there and open a convenience store, even though it's zoned commercial, because that's not an allowed use in that area. You can't go put a restaurant in that building, even though you got 100,000 square feet and you own the
Wow.
building. You're not allowed to put a restaurant in there because that's not an allowed use. So zoning can be super nitpicky about what allowed uses are. So it
Kind of
can,
restrictive.
it is very restrictive, and it's meant to be very restrictive. So let's talk for a second about why this is meant to be so restrictive. Why did they create this list of allowed uses and illegal uses for a certain piece of property? Why not just let people do whatever they want to do with a piece of property? Folks, we've seen what happens when you allow that sort of development. When you allow that sort of development, you end up with a nightmare. Do I have anybody in the class from the eastern part of the state? Do I have anybody from near Greenville, that area? Anybody from that area? Tasha, I
Yeah.
see you bring her.
I lived in Halifax County.
You're from Halifax County?
Don't live there.
Okay. And by the way, Halifax County, you have my sympathy. No, I'm kidding. My parents live in Halifax County.
As a New Yorker, you right though.
Oh, it's an interesting place, ain't it?
Hey, I'm from Halifax County now. Hey.
Hey.
Listen, I grew up in Edgecombe County, and I thought I had seen it all for Edgecombe County, for Eastern North Carolina. And people used to tell me, those people in Roanoke Rapids, you've never seen anything like them. And I
graduated from Rocky Mount though, so I'm familiar with Edgecombe too.
And I didn't believe them until I went to Roanoke Rapids, and then I realized they were right. It's a whole different ballgame up there.
Try Beaufort County.
And so they're all unique. But I bring up Greenville as not a good example. I bring up Greenville as a poor example of a city that has not done a good job of planning.
Right.
What is the traffic like at 5 o'clock in Greenville?
horrible.
It's a nightmare.
Crazy.
People don't believe me when I say this. It's 10 times worse than Raleigh. You can drive through Raleigh at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, downtown Raleigh, a lot easier than you can get from one side of Greenville to the other. And it is specifically because Greenville has never taken zoning seriously. They let you can have a strip club beside an elementary school, beside a hospital, beside somebody who is selling nuclear waste, and they don't care. And what that leads to is absolute chaos, because you get 18-wheelers trying to turn out onto a road where there's also school buses trying to get into a driveway, where there's also people trying to get to Walmart because they got to go buy their groceries. And it's all in the same parking lot. And it is gridlock. It's awful. And so people don't like zoning because zoning is like Big Brother-ish, and it's very controlling, and it is. It's all those things. But we have to recognize the trade-offs of that are, if you just let people do whatever they want to do with the property they own, then they're not really paying attention to how their use impacts what other people are doing and how that's going to have a bigger impact on the community. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
So the argument against zoning is, of course, it's my property. I should be able to do what I want to do. The argument for zoning is, well, do you actually want people to be able to move from one side of town to the other and be able to, have a sense of community versus everything just being thrown in a blender and thrown together? And so there are definitely arguments for and against it. I will tell you this, though, as a real estate agent in North Carolina, zoning rules are probably some of the most important things we deal with, because the biggest disaster I can possibly imagine is you having a client of yours who purchases a property for one specific use and finds out after they've purchased the property that the very thing that they want to use the property for is not an allowed use. Do you all think that would get you sued? Do you all think that would probably lead you to a court of law?
Absolutely.
Yes.
If you have, just as an example, what if I am dealing with this, not me personally, but trying to help somebody through it right now. She sold, and this was a residential transaction, not even a commercial transaction. She sold a house to a lady whose profession is teaching piano lessons. And she teaches piano lessons out of her house. She has for the last 20 years. And listen, the real estate agent took piano lessons from her. So the real estate agent is very aware that that is this person's job, that is this person's profession, that they see students in the house. Sold the person a new house in an area of town that specifically in the zoning says you cannot operate any type of a home business out of your home. Is the time to find that out after you've bought the house, after you've bought the
No.
property,
Oh, man.
or before you make an offer on the property?
What did you hire homegirls for?
Well, and that's the point. Seth brings up the point. Why did we hire an expert if they're not going to help protect us in the transaction?
Exactly. I
You
would
know?
want to.
And so it is very important to understand how zoning works and how it might limit what somebody can do with a property. So testing, again, vocabulary you might see on the test. I'd say this is another test target here. The vocabulary, I call it the vocabulary of violations, right? Like this is the vocabulary of violations when it comes to zoning. When you find a zoning violation, and let's be clear what a zoning violation looks like. If the lady teaches piano lessons out of her house in an area that the zoning says no home businesses, is that a zoning violation?
Yes.
Yes, as simple as that. That's a zoning violation, right? So now let's go one step further because this is test as well. If that's a zoning rule, how would people go about complaining about that violation? Would they have to take this person to court and sue them as a private matter? Or would they be able to call the police and the city and get the government involved since this is a zoning issue? Which one would it be?
They can call the police.
They can call the police.
Call
They
the
can
police.
call the zoning office. They can get the government involved because this is a public land use restriction. And so let's say somebody calls the zoning office and says, listen, I can't even get in my driveway because, and here's why there are such zoning rules. I've had people say, well, that's stupid. Why would you have a rule somebody can't teach piano lessons at their house? Because here's what happens. The house is at the back of a cul-de-sac. What's going to happen when there are 3 or 4 cars that are there trying to drop off, pick up, wait, when you've got one mom who has 3 kids that all take piano lessons back to back to back, and so they just sit in the street for the entire time, and the people who live there can't park on their own street because it's full of people all the time who are picking up and dropping off from piano lessons.
True. Okay.
And that's why those kinds of things exist, because it has been an issue in the past when people operate home businesses. And so when we have something like that, if she goes in there and she teaches piano lessons, we have a violation. What we have to ask ourselves is that a legal violation? Because it's possible for violations to be legal. That's another thing we got to wrap our brain around. It's possible for a violation to be legal, but most violations are illegal uses. And 2 of the big terminologies we're going to come into is the legal non-conforming. Non-conforming just means violation. So a legal non-conforming use or an illegal non-conforming use. And folks,
And if your mind is wondering, like, what would make it like okay or what wouldn't, we're doing it right now.
it's all about the timing. It's all about the timing. If I could make you 2 timelines right here, and that would explain this probably better than anything else. Let me do a couple different colors here. I'm gonna make you 2 timelines. Here's the legal non-conforming use. Use starts. Rule in effect. What do you notice? Which one came first, the use or the rule?
The use.
The use.
All right, let's look down here at the bottom. We'll go to a different color. Let's look down here at the bottom. Here's a timeline for an illegal non-conforming use. Rule in effect first, and then what?
The use.
The use starts.
The use starts. Folks, the only difference between that use being considered a legal non-conforming use and an illegal non-conforming use is when they started the use compared to when the rule went into effect. Is everybody with me on that? Because, and this is why why zoning is so hard. Could there be somebody in the house next door who's already teaching piano lessons and they be legal to be teaching piano lessons in their house, even though it's zoned no home businesses?
Yes, grandfather.
Yes. If
If
they
was there
started,
before the rule came
if they
into
started teaching piano lessons before the zoning ordinance said no home businesses, then can they continue legally as a non-conforming use? What do y'all think?
Yes.
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 Yes,
Yeah.
they can. How many of you have ever heard of something being grandfathered in? You ever heard that express? It's a cliched expression, right? You know, we say that, oh, that's grandfathered in because they've been doing it for so long.
I was
What
grandfathered in my immigration status.
Right. So immigration statuses sometimes are like that. Like, you know, like with DACA, for example, was basically like a version of grandfathering people in. You know, you've been here for a period of time, so we're gonna, you know, allow that status. When you look at the legal non-conforming use, what we always know is that the use, when the use started, it was legal. The rule changed after the use was in place. Is everybody good with me on that? So this is the lady across the street who's lived there for 30 years. She's the reason they got a rule that says you can't teach piano lessons. She's the one that drove everybody crazy. And guess what? The one that drove everybody crazy can keep teaching piano lessons at her house because she was doing it what?
before
the
the
rule.
rule came
Before
into
the
effect.
rule. But our new buyer who comes in now when the rule is already in place
Okay,
and wants
got
to
it.
start teaching piano lessons, what would be the terminology for her use of the property?
Illegal.
Illegal.
Illegal use. Does everybody see the difference between those two?
Mm-hmm.
Are we all?
So
Now,
even though on our slides, we have on the very first one, we have those two definitions of public versus private. I'm just going to start out with public because these do fall under public.
yes, we're talking about all the public ones first.
Okay.
Exactly. So the timing here matters a lot, because if we carry this to its logical conclusion, what we're saying here is that a legal non-conforming use, we may not like it, the city may not like it, but they have to allow it to do what?
Continue.
To
To
continue.
continue to use.
They have to allow it to continue. Now, they do not have to allow it to be expanded or improved. Do they have to let the little old lady who's been teaching piano lessons for 30 years build a new studio on the side of her house that accommodates more piano students?
No.
No,
No.
they just can do
Because
what
that
they
would be an
do.
expansion of the use, and they don't have to allow that. But they do have to allow her to basically continue what she was already doing. But can they come in to the new person, who, by the way, sees half the traffic of the old person? Can they come to the new person and say, you can't teach a single lesson ever at all because your use is illegal? Can we do that in the same cul-de-sac with two people doing the same thing?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Yes, and it's all about the timing. How do we all feel about that? Are you okay with a test question on that?
Yes.
I got it now.
Okay, good, good. Now, there is one other vocabulary word that deals with violations. There is such a thing as asking for permission to break the rule. Going to the planning office, to the zoning body, and saying, I understand what your rules say, but I need a break. Cut me some slack. The asking for permission to violate the rules is called a variance. Okay, you're asking for them to make an exception to the rules for you. So our new piano teacher, what's her only option to be able to proceed with teaching piano lessons? She would need to request a what?
Variance.
A variance, right? She would need to request a variance. I can go ahead and tell you what the answer to her variance is going to be. No. It's the answer to every variance ever requested in the history of man. No, just because these exist does not mean they are easy to come by. They do happen on rare occasion, but here's why I present it that way. On the test, they're going to give you things like people are entitled to a variance. Can you eliminate that statement right there? When somebody says something,
Yes.
we're entitled to a variance. Yeah, you're not entitled to a variance. You're not entitled to your mom telling you you can come home at midnight, even though the rule is 11 o'clock. You may beg and you may ask, but
Right.
ultimately, what's the likely answer?
No,
No.
that's not enough.
No, you're
No.
supposed to be home by 11. The rule is 11. Get your butt home by 11. I don't care why you want to stay out till midnight. The rule is 11 o'clock. I'm not giving you a variance. And that is the answer for almost all of these. I will tell you one thing that I think is likely, if they're going to ask a variance question on the test, I think it likely has to do with what you have to show in order to get a variance. You have to show harm. You have to show that the rule, the ordinance, that's what the zoning laws are called. They're called ordinances. You have to show that the ordinance is harming you particularly, like more than it harms everybody else. Not that it just hurts you. Oh, I teach piano lessons. Yes, but what about everybody else who bought in this same neighborhood? How is this rule hurting you any worse than it's hurting them? And that's why it's so hard to come by a variance, because you have to prove this very particular harm to you. Harm. How do we all feel there? Okay, so it's very hard to come by. And generally, the other thing I would point out to you, it's not a variance to ask for, like, this is not an example of a variance. I own property in Cary that's zoned residential use, minimum 1/4 acre lot size, single family homes. That is a true statement of the property I own in Cary. That's what it's zoned for. It's zoned for residential, single family homes. So can you put an apartment on here?
No.
No,
Can you put a duplex on here?
no.
No.
No, it's zoned
Single
residential,
family.
single family home, minimum 1/4 acre lot size. So can you put 3 houses can you put 5 houses on an acre? No, the lots would be too small, right? So there's all those restrictions apply to my property. This would be an example of a variance. Can I please build a house on 0.23 acres? I know it's supposed to be 0.25, but I've got this lot that's 0.23 and I can't get the additional land from anywhere else. Can we have a variance? That would be an example of asking for a variance. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes. Yeah.
This would not be an example of asking for a variance. Can I put a gas station on this lot? You're not asking for a variance then, you're asking for rezoning. When you're asking for like this huge, like, we want to just completely depart from what is supposed to be on this property completely, that's a rezoning request. Does everybody see the difference between those?
Yes.
Variance is for narrow little things. When your time to be home is 11 o'clock, asking your mom to stay out till midnight is a variance. Asking your mom if you can move to Bali and tattoo your body from head to toe is a rezoning request. You gotta understand that rezoning is much further along than variance. Okay.
And honestly, I'm pretty sure I saw a practice test question like that. So that's pretty much prime test material too.
Yeah, I
the
think
example
so.
you just gave.
Just recognizing the difference. I think you probably won't see a test question about conditional uses or special uses. I don't think you need to focus nearly as much on that. But basically, conditional uses are ones that are never really allowed or illegal. They're ones that you have to ask for on a case-by-case basis. They're ones that the city knows people are going to want to do, but they want to be able to control how many of them there are. I'll give you an example of conditional uses in most cities. Churches are conditional uses, like houses of worship. Not just Christian churches, but all houses of worship are conditional uses. That means it's not allowed to build a church in Raleigh, but it's also not illegal to build a church in Raleigh. It means if you want to build a church in Raleigh, you have to go to the city and specifically ask if you can build a church on that piece of property. The reason they do it that way is if they just said churches were allowed, could we end up with 10 on the same street?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
would that create obvious problems
Chaos, yeah.
for number
Yeah.
one, traffic on certain days of the week, right? Number two,
Noise.
think about policing that area. If it was nothing in the world but churches, which are pretty much empty 6 days a week, you would have a real problem with policing because they would get broken into, right? Because they're, it would be a prime target. And so trying to keep those kinds of things interspersed throughout the community, that's what we mean with conditional uses. It's basically on a case by case basis.
Okay, and so this would not be the same or would be the same as if you were wanting to do the same with a gas station?
No, because gas stations, what they would tell you about a gas station is we already have areas in the city where you can build a gas station, buy land in those areas. With
Okay.
conditional uses, there is nowhere in Raleigh that's zoned for a church.
Okay.
It doesn't exist anywhere. You would have to go to the city and say, I'm looking at this piece of property. Is it okay in this instance to construct a church on this property? And they look on them literally case by case.
Okay.
That's what the conditional use is.
I'm gonna pass on the recap for this because I don't remember going too much over it.
Okay. Overlay districts, again, not something I think you're likely to see big testing on. This is just where you add additional restrictions to a property, like as an example, historic preservation. So if you think about like a historic zone like Oakwood in downtown Raleigh or any other historic neighborhood, that area is zoned residential. And it's probably zoned residential single family, but residential single family would allow you to build a brand new house. An overlay district is a set of additional restrictions that you lay over the district. You say, okay, we understand it's residential and it's single family, but we also want to have this additional layer of restrictions that say you can't tear down a house that was built before 1800. Is everybody okay with that? The idea of like overlaying additional restrictions on
Yes.
certain areas? Okay. So you might say these 10 blocks are zoned residential single family, but these 2 blocks of that 10, we're going to overlay this additional restriction and say this has got to be for historic preservation. So it's just an additional set of restrictions that you put on a smaller area of the map.
Are they recorded?
It is, well, none of these are recorded in the sense of at the county courthouse. They are available at your local municipality. They're available through the government. You go to the city planning and zoning office to see them.
So if you're selling a property to somebody who's planning on tearing it down and it's an historic landmark, that information would come up on.
You need to go to the city to check the planning and zoning maps.
All right, gotcha.
So that's a great question. You go to the courthouse to look for the private restrictions, like the deed restrictions. You go to the city or county to look for public restrictions, government restrictions. Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Another example of government public controls is building codes. Building codes are another example of how, now this is separate from zoning. So we've left zoning behind. We've covered the zoning and its terminology. Now we're talking about another method in which the government can step in and control land use. Even once we've said, okay, now you can use that land for residential purposes, single family, you got to have a 1/4 acre lot. We're not done with the government yet. Is the government going to come in and say, and the structure you build on there must meet these certain safety standards? What do y'all think?
Yes. Yes.
And those safety standards for the physical structure are called the building codes. So you have land use controls with zoning that controls what the land is used for. And then you get this whole other level of government controls for the actual structure that is going to be built on the land. And that's the building codes.
And not to beat a dead horse, but sometimes I just need to hear it like this. So we're still in public. We started with public. Number one would be zoning and their legal versus illegal non-conforming uses. Number two that we're going over is now building codes.
That's right. Which are just another example of public land use controls. We're still in public. We haven't shifted gears out of that yet. So again, if we're still in public land use controls, who would you go to if you found a violation of the building codes? Would you have to go to court and sue the person who violated the building codes? Or could you call the police? Could you call the city government? Could you call the county?
All the police.
Government.
Police, government, right? Because these are public land use controls, which are going to be enforced by the police or the government. That's that police power thing, right? And so when it comes to building codes, the state of North Carolina, like every other state, has statewide minimums. Now, I hear people say this all the time. Well, the state building code says I can do this. Why do I have to follow the Cary building code? Here's what the state building codes say. The state building codes say it has to at least meet our standard, but local municipalities can go further. So here's my question for you all. Is it possible that Cary has more stringent, tougher, stricter building codes than Garner or than Beaufort or than Wilmington? Is that possible?
Yes.
Yes, absolutely. Because the state sets a minimum standard, and then some counties just follow the minimum standard. Like as an example, I'm from Edgecombe County. Edgecombe County does not have its own building code. It follows the state building code. But then when you get into the city of Raleigh, they have their whole own building code. And the state minimums are they look at that as like, that's not enough. We want it stricter than that. You know, I'll give you an example of what I mean. The state building code, best of my memory, you're not gonna be tested on this, so don't worry about it, but best of my memory, the state building code says if you build a townhouse, the shared wall between the townhouses, you know what I'm talking about, the party wall, the wall between the two houses, has to be rated for fire burn through for 30 minutes. In other words, if there's a fire in one of the houses, that wall should be able to withstand that fire from spreading to the next house for 30 minutes. That's the state building code. The town of Cary is 2 hours.
Oh, wow.
So is there going to be a major difference in a townhouse constructed in the town of Cary versus one built in Edgecombe County, where Edgecombe County is employing just the state building codes and the town of Cary has their own much more strict building codes?
Right.
Yeah, most certainly.
So that's the difference there. And
Nacho desayuno.
the purpose of building codes is safety. Safety is the primary goal of the minimum building codes. There are two terminologies that we will see, that you will see when it comes to testing about building codes. And that is the building permit versus the certificate of occupancy. A building permit is what begins the construction process. Okay. A building permit, and yes, Alicia, the same ideas apply to apartment complexes, not necessarily the same rules about construction for townhouses versus apartments, but the same ideas apply, which is that certain municipalities are going to have far greater restrictions on the construction quality of things, right? The building permit sort of kicks off the process of construction. You are asking for permission. Now, let me be clear, and I'm going to say this because you need to know it as a real estate agent in the state. It's not going to be tested, so I don't want to spend a bunch of time on it, but I just want to be clear on this. There is no construction at all in this state that does not require a building permit. If the question comes up when you're talking to a buyer or seller of, do I need to get a permit for that? What is your answer? Give it to me.
Yes.
Yes, that is the legal
you do.
answer. Now, whether somebody actually goes and obtains a building permit or not is between them and their local municipality. But folks, to give you an example, in the state of North Carolina, Installing a ceiling fan requires a building permit. Changing a receptacle in the state of North Carolina requires a building permit.
What
We-
about changing the receptacle cover?
The cover does not. That is a vanity item. The cover does
You could have
not.
said yes.
I should have said, but I mean, but my point is this: almost any question you get asked in this business of, do you have to get a permit for that? What should your answer be based on the state building code?
Yes.
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 Even replacement of like a one rotten decking board. If somebody's got a step on their deck that's rotten and they just go get one new piece of decking board to replace it, that is considered a structural change in the state of North Carolina that requires the issuance of a building permit. Now, whether people actually obtain them,
Oh, okay.
our job is not enforcement. Our job is to give the correct answer to the question, right?
Correct. Whether people follow these or not is a different landscape here.
And I always
We're not
go
on
back
that
to
one.
the speed limit analogy. If somebody asks you the speed limit, don't say, well, you know, everybody drives like 90. Just tell them what the sign says. The speed limit is 65. It is up to them if they decide to drive faster than 65 or not. So when somebody says, do I need a permit? Your answer is yes, you do. State law requires you to have a permit for that. Okay.
Okay, Travis, sorry, question. So I didn't know that. So we're getting ready to change a ceiling fan. I have to go get a permit for that?
Well,
Yes.
that is what state law is. Are
my
you asking me personally, would I obtain a permit for installing a ceiling fan? The answer would be no, and no, no, no.
What about, sorry, what about for, my stairs didn't have railing, so my husband tore them
That
down.
requires a permit.
Jesus Christ.
I'm
Okay,
actually getting ready to help renovate my grandparents' house. We're gonna like put insulation in the attic and do
That
different
requires
things
a
like that.
permit,
Uh-huh.
right?
We ain't gonna get one.
And people make their own decisions about whether they, now, here's what I would tell you. Obviously, anytime you do something without obtaining a permit, you are circumventing the building code process. Because so when we go back and ask ourselves, and that's why it's important to point this out, what is the purpose of the permit? The purpose of the permit is to notify the city or county that you're planning to do this work. They're going to ask you what your plans are, and they're going to issue a permit. The permit simply allows you to do the work. In order to, quote unquote, close out the permit or finish the process, you have to go back to the city or county and ask for, what is that other document down there at the bottom? So this-
Certificate of occupancy.
that's right. If
Certificate of
this is the
occupancy.
beginning, then the end is what we call the certificate of occupancy. Here's what happens when you go take out a building permit. Let's just use a ceiling fan as an example. You want to put in a ceiling fan. You go to your city's planning and zoning office and you say, okay, I want a building permit. I'm putting a ceiling fan in my bedroom. They're going to charge you $75 or whatever the fee is for the permit. They're going to issue you a permit. You go buy the ceiling fan, you install the ceiling fan. Now you've got this permit that's still open with the city. You've already paid the fee, so you may as well finish the process. There's not going to be an additional fee here. You paid for this when you paid for the permit. You're going to contact the city and you're going to say, we're done with the installation. Guess what your $75 permitting fee actually paid for? They're going to send who?
An
Building
inspector.
inspector.
An inspector. They're going to send this guy in the picture out to your house to look at your ceiling fan and ensure that it was installed according to the local and state building codes. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay,
You know,
Travis.
if you
There
don't-
was,
If
Go
you
ahead,
don't
Elizabeth.
get a building permit, it can really affect the saleability of the property or
It
your,
can.
because they can, like an appraiser can decline to give value to a portion of the house that was added on that didn't have a permit.
That's
oh
exactly
my
right.
gosh. Going right down that alley I was going down to. There was an example you gave, Travis, of somebody who finished their attic. It was beautiful. And they had to tear it down, not tear it down, but rip the walls out and stuff, improve.
So here's an example. I have seen appraisers come in and look at a finished basement, and the basement was finished by the homeowners after they bought the property, and they did not obtain a permit, And so therefore they didn't have an inspection done by the building inspectors. And so they didn't have a certificate of occupancy. Is everybody following me on that?
Yes.
So an appraiser comes in when they're trying to sell the house and the appraiser says, well, we can't count this square footage. Do you think that impacted the value of the home dramatically? Right? The appraiser said it counts as square footage, but we can't give value to it because we don't know if it was constructed safely or not. Is everybody following me on that? We have no idea if this space is safe for occupancy. And so here's what happened. The homeowners who were trying to sell the property said, well, we'll go get the permit. We'll go get the certificate of occupancy. And the appraiser said, fine, call me back when you got that and I'll come back and we will add value for this space once you have a certificate of occupancy. So they contacted the town of Apex. In this case, it was Apex. And Apex said, well, we'll have to send somebody out there to look at it before we can issue you a permit, because the permit was supposed, because you're going to them saying, we broke your rules. You're going to them saying, we didn't get a permit. We've already done this work and we want you to just rubber stamp, issue the permit, issue the certificate of occupancy. And they said, well, no, we can't do that. We will issue you the permit, but we have to come out and inspect the work to issue the certificate of occupancy. Does that make sense for everybody where we're headed here?
Yes.
So they send the building inspector out. The building inspector says, well, I see you did electrical work and plumbing work. And they said, yes, it's got a kitchen and a bathroom and it's got, you know, lights and HVAC. And the building inspector said, I need to see all of that. And they said, well, how are you going to see it? It's behind the sheetrock. He said, that's your problem. And so everywhere in that basement, folks, that there was a switch, a receptacle, a sink, a toilet, they had to rip out the sheetrock so that the building inspector could see the work done behind the sheetrock for those places. So could this be disastrously more expensive for somebody who does not comply with the process from the beginning in the way it's supposed to be done?
Just reading that definition, get it before you start.
Right. So,
Which is exactly right. What Elizabeth was saying, it could absolutely affect the saleability of that property.
and so I think Tyler, to me, has the practical application of it down, if not the letter of the law, which is, if you think this is going to significantly impact the value or use of the property, then you better go through the permitting process. Because if you expect the next person to be able to assign value to this thing that you just did, they're going to want to see a permit and they're going to want to see a certificate of occupancy to know that it was done correctly.
And I'm probably beating the dead horse here, but you know, that would be the basement you finished, the attic you finished, the porch that you enclosed to be a sunroom.
The renovated kitchen, you know, even if you renovated it yourself, people want to see, because that involves plumbing. I mean, here's the thing. I've heard people say, well, I didn't get a permit because I renovated my kitchen myself. I'm thinking to myself, shit, that's all the more reason I want to see a permit and a certificate of occupancy. You did it yourself. I don't trust you to do that plumbing and electrical work, you know? So
I have a question.
Yep.
So this is so funny to me that you brought this up. We just renovated, you know, the living room and the bathroom, and, you know, the builder basically, or the guy that was doing all the work basically told us, you know, hey, this is going to improve your house value by 10 grand because we did like a huge bathroom transformation. But no, we did not get a building permit. So really, that's completely invalid, right?
That is correct for most buyers, because most buyers are going to look at that and say, because here's what most buyers that would be buying it would be thinking to themselves, I don't want to be the one to pay $10,000 more for this bathroom and then have somebody come back and tell me it has no value because it wasn't done correctly. So they're probably going to want to see you remedy that situation before you sell it to them.
So there's nothing, since we did not obtain a building permit before we did all this, there would be no way to say, hey, it's actually worth 10 grand more.
Well, there's no way to say it is or isn't. The only statement we can say is we don't know for sure that it was done safely, because the process that was meant to determine that it was done safely was skipped.
And so
Mhm.
Travis, stop me
Right.
if you will, but whenever you would see something like this online, you would see something like this is a 2,000 square foot home, 400 in addition was unpermitted.
Well, right, that's
So
exactly right. It would be marketed and you can still sell it. You can still say, you know, like
the
that,
ramifications.
but you would have to tell somebody that, hey, that bathroom that's renovated, it's unpermitted. So that you're warning them that there's this issue
It would
potentially exists.
stay
And-
with the
and-
property.
And
But could
by the way,
possibly
could it
still
have
tell-
been done? Could it have been done perfectly? Sure, we just don't know.
But could you, but is there still a possibility that we could sell the house for more with all these renovations that we've done, even though we haven't?
Sure. If that's up to a buyer, that's up to
Oh.
a buyer.
It's
Buyer
just
may-
that fact is going to stick
a
with it.
buyer may never
Okay.
raise an issue about it, but some buyers might. And so
Yeah,
that's,
if you're representing a buyer, I'm gonna wanna see your permits.
that's it.
Because what if the house burns down, my insurance doesn't cover it because you did the work unpermitted, then sucks to be me.
That's another issue that comes up with unpermitted space. What if a fire starts in something electrical in that bathroom and your insurance company finds out that it's unpermitted? They may not pay the claim for your whole house. They may refuse to pay it and say, well, you broke the law by doing this renovation without going through the building code process. We never issued you an insurance policy to say, come in here and create a fire trap. And listen, your insurance company, you got to remember, doesn't want to pay you. So they will look for things like that. So there's a real danger to not complying with these processes. These are laws. It's up to you whether you comply with them or not. Okay?
So who gets the permit? The owner of the house having the renovations or your contractor builder who you're
It's
having do the work?
ultimately the responsibility of the property owner to make sure it's done. Whether they hire somebody or not, they should ensure that it's done. Now, if you're if you're hiring a professional, that would be part of what I would expect them to do. That doesn't mean I'm not going to check up on them. You can believe even though HGTV renovated my house and did all the work, you can best your sweet rear end. I checked to see that they got permits for all of it and that they had inspections done on all of it and got certificate of occupancy for all of it, because I still paid $120,000 for that renovation. And if and when I ever decide I want to sell this house, I want to make sure nobody comes back to me and says, well, you got this beautiful kitchen, but it's not permitted. I don't want that to happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, okay. And the permits are available. You can go to the city planning and zoning office. You can see when they were opened. You can see when the inspections were done. You can see when the certificate of occupancy was issued. So test taking question. What is the purpose of a certificate of occupancy? And this is a question you're going to miss if you're not careful. Because one of the answer choices they're going to put on there is like, it says the property is safe for human occupancy. That's not actually what a certificate of occupancy says. A certificate of occupancy says the building codes were followed. That's what the certificate of occupancy says. It says the building codes were followed. Because the city's never actually going to tell you a property is safe, because then they'd be on the hook if somebody got hurt in the property, right? They're not
that's
going
a
to
good point.
guarantee somebody's safety in a property. They're just going to say the building codes were followed.
Okay, one more question and I won't ask again. So what about if an appraiser, like an independent appraiser, were to come out and look at what we've done after the fact? Does that change anything, or?
Nothing changes the fact that you skipped the safety process. Tricia, I'm not going to give you an answer you want here, which
Right,
is
right.
you
No, and I know that.
you skipped the process, which was,
Right.
so we have literally no idea what the level of compliance or non-compliance is with that thing. And so it would be anybody's guess what anybody would do. If you have all those questions, there's only one way to eliminate those questions. It is to go back and participate in the building code process, which in and of itself is going to create its own challenges, because you're doing the process from backwards. You know, you're starting from, you already got the bathroom done. And depending on where you are, that may not be hard. I mean, some places may say, thank you for coming and getting the building code and telling us about it. And they'll send an inspector and he'll crawl around and look under the sink and give you a certificate of occupancy. Some may make you tear some things out. It's all how much you're nervous about that is going to determine whether or not you get in compliance. None of the rest
Retro permitting?
all the rest of the questions you have cannot be answered. So how much those questions eat you up is going to determine whether or not you get in compliance. Really.
So
An unfortunate
so
reality.
does the certificate of occupancy work for even multiple jobs you're doing at home, like kitchen, bathroom, living rooms? Or
Every permit has to have a certificate of occupancy to close it out. So if you're doing one major renovation that does 6 rooms, then yes, there'll only be one permit and one certificate of occupancy, because that one permit will have the scope of the entire job. But if you install a water heater this week, that's a permit and that's a certificate of occupancy to close out that permit, because the only thing mentioned on that permit is going to be the water heater. And then 2 weeks later, you renovate a bathroom. There's going to be another permit for that bathroom renovation. And so every separate job, every permit, you're telling them, this is the work I intend to do. Now, you can't go get a permit for a water heater and then have them come out and show them, oh, well, I also renovated my kitchen and we added on a deck and we put a barn in the backyard. They're not going to issue you a certificate of occupancy for all that, because they're going to say these other things were never permitted in the first place. You've got to go back to step 1 and get permits for all of this work, and then we'll inspect it.
And the definition is so on point with it. Travis, I just had sent you a message somebody had sent me, and I think it's awesome. When a broker does the measurements on a home, should new work be questioned?
Absolutely. I love that question. Whoever asked that question, you need.
Can you repeat it?
So here's the question. When as a real estate broker, we're walking through a property, we're measuring a property, we're looking at listing a property, and we see renovated things, new things. And listen, it's not hard to find them, folks. Aren't those exactly the things people point out when they're trying to sell something? Don't people take you right to it and say, oh, look, we just renovated. I mean, think about Trisha's example. I'm not going to pick on her, but if she was selling her house, was one of the first things she put in the listing, newly renovated bathroom. There's your alarm bell right there as a real estate broker. As a real estate broker, what do you say to that seller that shows you, oh, we got a new roof, we got a new HVAC system, we got a new water heater, we got a new
awesome.
Did you have a building permit?
Permit. Every single thing they just listed off. You just sit there and you make a list and the list. Oh, that's good. You did that. Oh, nice. Okay, where's the permit? Where's the permit for this? Where's the permit for that? Because every single one of those things.
You can email it to here.
Going to have a permit, and if it was inspected properly, we'll have a certificate of occupancy. So yeah, Sierra, to your question, that's exactly the alarm bell that should go off when people start saying new. And by the way, not only do I want to see permits for it, think about mechanics liens that we talked about last week. I want to see receipts, and it's also been what?
Paid for.
So they can't put
No
a lien
liens
against
attached.
the property.
So if they did like added on a sunroom, we need to make sure there's no liens, that it was permitted before counting it in the square footage. Yeah.
That's it.
We just got this new dishwasher. Where's the receipt?
Where's the receipt? Where's the permit? Where's the, I want to see it all. You know,
that is great.
That's what you do as a real estate agent. You learn how to, it's great that you got this new thing, but have we followed all the processes? And that's why we learn the processes, so we know to make sure they're followed.
So that
remember, folks, why is this process so difficult to obtain a real estate license? The state of North Carolina is expecting you to take on the job of helping them enforce all these rules. Now, we're not the police, but we're supposed to speak up and say, there's a law, there's a rule, you're supposed to be doing this, there's a rule about that, because the public doesn't. How many of you all think the public knows they need a permit for a ceiling fan? How many of you all think
who knew this before right now?
Right.
I didn't.
And so they expect us to know it, so that when we get involved in these transactions, because most transactions do happen with the help of a real estate agent. Here's the simple truth. If 95% of homes are sold with the help of a real estate agent, and if every real estate agent was really diligent about pointing out, hey, you need a permit for this, you need to get receipts for that, would we have very many problems with unpermitted spaces in North Carolina, or would most of them get taken care of simply by the real estate agents pointing out you needed to do that?
Yeah, from the start.
And
they'd be taken care of.
That's why we teach it to you, because we're in these houses. We're there. We see these things. And so we should
Great
point
thing.
them out to people. Okay. How we all feel about that?
Great.
Okay.
Loving it.
Why don't we take a break there? I got 10:25. Why don't we take a 10-minute break, come back 10:35? And we're going to pick it back up with some other examples of controls that we might have. So let's take a 10-minute break right there. Come back at 10:35. Okay.
Awesome. Thank you.
Here and then thank you. So when we left off before lunch, or no, before break, we haven't had lunch. I don't want to do that to us. Before the break, we left off, we were talking about these public land use controls, and we're going to pick that back up. One of the most extreme examples of the public control of land is when the government actually takes ownership of the land. I mean, you can't really think of anything much more extreme than that, than a government agency coming in. And this could be a local government, it could be state government, it could be the federal government in some cases. It's almost always local or state though. But I can't think of anything more extreme. It's one thing if the government comes in and says, okay, you have to use your property for residential purposes, or you can't build a building more than 5 stories tall. I mean, those are very much infringements on the control and use of the land. It's another thing entirely when the government comes in and says, you don't own this anymore. And so think of eminent domain as a government action where the owner of the real estate is not interested in selling, but they are being forced to sell by the government. Because if you think about it, normally property owners cannot be forced to sell their property unless they have defaulted on a loan and they've gone through the foreclosure process or something like that. But in general, like my house, I guarantee you, if I was to put my house on the market, there would be 100 offers right now in this crazy market that we are in right now. And I also guarantee you that if private people had the right to force me to sell, I've already been forced to sell, because there's that many crazy people out there trying to buy houses in Cary right now. But ultimately, if I don't want to sell, they can't make me sell. Private people can't make other private people sell property. But guess who does have the ability, the authority through this police power to come in and force an owner to sell their property? The government can.
Big brother.
That process is called eminent domain. The eminent domain is the name of the process for a government agency to take over ownership of the property. Now, one of the, I think, misconceptions about eminent domain is that the property is being essentially stolen. It is not being stolen. It is a forced sale of the property. It is forcing the owner to sell. But now I will tell you, there's a lot of force going on here with the sale, because not only are they dictating to the property owner, you will sell us this property and you do not have the right to fight us in purchasing this property. Guess who is also deciding the sales price? It's the government that's going to be the buyer. Guess who's also deciding the sales price?
The government.
The government is. They are essentially coming in and saying to this private landowner, we want your property and we will pay you this amount for it. Now get out.
Yep.
That is the exercise of the right of eminent domain. That process is called condemnation. The taking of the property is called, now we've often heard of like property being condemned, and we think of it as like the property's in bad condition, or it's, you know, the structure's falling down. But condemnation is actually the taking of the land and turning it in from private land. Now, this is the other thing you need to understand that's happening in eminent domain. If a government entity is purchasing the land is no longer going to be private property. It's going to be what kind of property?
Public.
It's going to be public property. It's going to be public property. It's going to be used for public purposes. Probably the single best, most common example of the use of eminent domain is in the construction of roads. Roads would almost never be built, certainly would never be expanded if it were not for eminent domain. Because if you think about it, when you need to widen a roadway, people own the land on either side of that roadway. And to widen the roadway, you need to get, if there's 1,000 property owners that own land on either side of that street that you're going to widen, what are the odds of getting all 1,000 of them to negotiate with you and agree to sell you part of their property so that you can widen that road? How long would it take if you had to individually go to each one and ask them if they'd be willing to sell you a portion of their property? And there still wouldn't be any guarantee. Are you always going to have some holdouts who just wouldn't, no matter how much money the government offered them, right? And so that's why this power exists. This power essentially allows the government to say, no, it is in the best interest of the public if we do this. It is in the best interest of the public if we convert this property from private property into public property. And listen, I don't know how I can stress this enough. Nothing that matters to the landowner is going to matter to the government. So it doesn't matter how sentimental the land is. It doesn't matter how attached to it you are. As an example, my family farm in Edgecombe County, it has been in my mom's family since 1780. That is very important to my mom and her sister. Would that matter if the state of North Carolina wanted to put a highway through the middle of that farm?
No.
No. And they're not going to pay you anything extra for the sentimental value of it. I'll tell you another thing that's not going to matter. My family, a lot of them are buried on that farm. They don't care. They will move them.
Wow.
And put them somewhere else to put that road there. So you need to understand this process is very cold. It is very uncaring. And in North Carolina, the property owner does not have any argument legally to stop the taking of the land. Now, there are states where you can fight it. There are states that give property owners a little bit more in the way of rights to fight this. North Carolina is not one of them. The only thing you can fight about this process in North Carolina is the amount of the money. You can fight for more money. You can essentially sue the state of North Carolina or sue the city, whoever's taking the property from you, and fight for more money. But here's what you need to remember about that. While you're suing them for more money, they've already done what with the land?
Took it.
They already took it. They're not going to wait for you to claim you need more money. They're going to take the land. That happens instantly. And they will pay you what they think is a fair price. And if you want to sue them for more money, that might take you years to go back and wind through that process. That is,
if there anything
question,
like
Travis.
Go ahead.
Sure.
How do they come up with the amount that they pay them? Are they paying them? I'm sure they're not paying them the sale price of what they paid for the property. How do the government determine?
Well, so the law, the statute says they have to pay just or fair compensation. So they will appraise the property. They have appraisers that do this full time, especially like for the North Carolina Department of Transportation, as you can imagine. They are, as a matter of fact, if any of you all really want to be the most hated person in real estate, this is a specialty in real estate. There are real estate agents in this state who work for the Department of Transportation, who their full-time job is to go knock on people's doors and say, hey, we're taking the front 20 feet of your property, and here's what we're willing to pay you today for it. Wouldn't you love that job?
No.
Not at all.
I do believe they are all armed. I think, and I'm not kidding about that, because you have no idea how ugly these conversations get sometimes. When you come into certain people and you are telling them that you are imagine if you are going to tear down the house that 5 generations of their family was raised in because you're going to put a road through there. That happens.
That's so true.
My father is in that situation. He's had a church for 27 years, and where the church is at now, they want to put a new highway going through there. So all of the homes that are out there, as well as the churches, they have to go.
Yes, absolutely. And have to deal with the amount of compensation and then try to find, and so like Rachel brought up, like 540 down in Holly Springs and in those areas. Think about those people right now in that situation. Yes, the state is coming in and paying money to these property owners, but do you know how hard it is to find something else to live in right now in Wake County, Cary, Holly Springs, Fuquay, Varina, those areas where they're taking those properties, and they're being thrust out, not by their own choice, into this market of having to find something, but because the state is taking their home and tearing it down to build 540.
That sucks.
It's not fun. It's not fun.
Hey, Travis, so when you was like speaking of Halifax County and speaking of eminent domain, you know how they put the Randy Parton Theater? Would that have been considered?
That was done through eminent domain as well. The Carolina Crossroads, Randy Parton Theater out there, all of that land.
Even though they didn't.
Yeah. Even that land was taken through eminent domain. They basically said this was a public economic development project, and the city and county went in and condemned all of that land that complex was built on.
It's crazy. And yeah, now that you mention it, a lot of the common examples do kind of resonate with roads. Thinking back, just in Sanford, they had put a bypass and eminent domain for a lot of those houses, and expanding the roads. And
yep. Well, parks.
Wow.
This happens with parks. This happens with all kinds of properties, where they were private property and now they see the need to develop them into some public use, and so they will come in and take the property.
And this would be highly different as if they had an easement on the property. This is no legal interest in the property.
An easement is taking use. This is taking ownership. So literally they are taking, the state or city is actually taking ownership of the property. They are transferring their convey and ownership. And sometimes they'll convey the entire property, but more often they will convey only the part they need. So they may build the roadway right up beside the house now. Maybe you had a 50-foot wide front yard before, and they only need 30 feet, and now your front door is 20 feet from the street because they only took, and they're only going to pay you what they think the value is of the 30 feet that they took.
Yes.
And so that's the problem. Somebody sent me a private question. Is this what happened in Cary with the gentleman who painted "Screwed by the Town of Cary" on the front of his house? This is exactly what happened in Cary. Because here's what happened in Cary. Several years ago, they widened Maynard Road in Cary, and they added a lane on each side, and they took, I believe it was 20 feet from the homes along one side of Maynard Road. Well, those homes had been there long, for many years, and most of them had fairly substantial front yards. But when you take 20 feet off of someone's front yard, is all of a sudden their front door much closer to the front of the street. Does that make sense for everybody? Right?
Yes.
And Seth is showing you a picture.
Wow.
Of how he painted the house back at that point in time. And as you can see from that picture, just how close the roadway was to the house after they took the front 20 feet due to eminent domain. Not only that, and if you'll leave that picture up for just a second.
Is it still showing, Travis?
Yeah, I see it.
Okay.
Which one is the before?
This is after. This is after the taking of, because remember, they did not take the whole property. They just took the 20 feet that they wanted. And what they did was it made the roadway, it went away now. It made
I'm pulling it up
very close to the front of the home. But the other thing they did was the intersection that was near there flooded a lot prior to that. So they elevated the roadway as part of the road widening project. Folks, look at the height, the elevation of that yard relative to the elevation of the roadway. What do you think happened every time it rained? The road didn't flood anymore, but what do you think did?
Flooded.
The house. It was destined to flood. And this was all related. And now his argument was this. His argument was not that the town of Cary didn't have the right to take his property. His argument was they should have taken his entire property, that they should have taken the home, the entire lot, and torn the house down, because the portion of the land that they were taking essentially made the rest of the lot unusable as a residential lot. Does that make sense for everybody, what he was arguing?
Yeah.
You're gonna drive down that driveway too, just saying.
Right. He was not arguing that they could not take the land. He was arguing that they didn't take enough of it, that they took that to, in other words, so they didn't have to pay him as much. They only took the front 20 feet, but what they really should have taken, because they made the property essentially useless, was the entire thing. And he was so frustrated with the process that he painted this on the front of his home. And that began a very long, ongoing fight between this gentleman and the town of Cary.
Did he win?
I'm sorry?
Did he win?
He did win. Ultimately, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, stepped in and defended him all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled in favor of this gentleman and said that the town of Cary should indeed have condemned the entire property and paid him the full market value of the property.
Yeah.
However, he had been dead for 2 years by the time that was finally decided.
Wow.
The case took so long to actually get decided that by the time he won, he was 2 years in the grave.
Or said he killed the man.
They killed him. They literally killed him with an eminent domain action. But that is an example of how ugly eminent domain can be as a process, because he didn't have the right to fight that they were taking the property. What he had the right to fight was how much they were compensating, and he did. But of course, that took quite a while. So there's your sad eminent domain story with and the house is no longer there. Once the state Supreme Court ruled in his favor, the town of Cary was forced to condemn the entire property, pay his heirs for the full market value of the home prior to the road work being commenced all those years before, plus legal fees and all that stuff. And then the house was torn down. Once the town was forced to take the whole property, they tore the house down, and it no longer is there. It was on the corner of Maynard and Kilmaine, and it's not there any longer.
Is it just a vacant lot now?
It is. It is vacant to this, still vacant, because it really can't be used because the road is too elevated right in front of it, and it's just too close.
Flooded his front door and everything.
Oh yeah. Oh, there was standing water in the house. It was awful. Escheat is another example of transferring ownership to the government, but in this case, it's a much less aggressive way of transferring ownership. In this case, the government is not taking anything. This is a case of a property owner who has died without having the right of survivorship, so it has no co-owners with the right of survivorship. Because remember, that's always the first place we look when somebody who owns real estate dies. First thing we look is, are they a tenant by the entirety, or are they a joint tenant? And if so, their share of that property ownership would go to their surviving co-owners, right? Because of the right of survivorship. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yep. We first look at the ownership, then continue.
If they do not have the right of survivorship with co-owners, then we would look to see if they have a will. And if they have a will, then we would distribute their ownership according to their will. If they die without a will, remember the state creates a will for them. That's called dying intestate, when you die without a will. If you die without a will, if you die with no survivorship, no right of survivorship in the property, and you don't have a will, and the state cannot locate any living heirs for you, then title or ownership of the property is going to transfer to the state of North Carolina, and the state will do whatever they want to with it. Most likely they'll auction it off. That's usually what the state does with things that they receive through the Escheat process. They hold auctions once a year, and they would auction the property off most likely and keep the money. so this is again why everyone, especially who owns real estate, should always have what in place, folks?
A will.
Well,
Because a will would prevent this from happening, would prevent the whole process of intestate succession. Don't rely on this. And this is why I laugh when people say, oh, I don't need a will because this is going to go to my kids anyway. I'm like, okay, so you're going to rely on the state of North Carolina to find your heirs for you when it's the state of North Carolina who would get your property if they couldn't find your heirs. Are they, folks, how hard are they really going to look? That's my question.
Not that hard.
Very true.
And so I would always recommend having a will, right? So somebody sent a private question. So what would happen if there's a restriction to have a minimum lot size, and because of an eminent domain action, the lot is now under the minimum lot size? Those have to be dealt with on case-by-case basis. You can't answer those kind of hypothetical situations, you know, in a situation like this. That would be something that would have to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, because obviously those kinds of, you know, conflicts can come up when you start altering the size of lots and doing those things, but it would be dealt with case by case.
And so just to kind of bring it back, real quick on that green box on the right, you know, let's just bring it back. When we say the title, the ownership, we're referring back to chapter number 2.1. That's the legal bundle of rights that gets transferred over to the state.
That's
So
right. The state becomes,
don't think of it as like a piece of paper.
The state becomes the owner of record. The property would be deeded over to the state. They would have ownership of the property at that point in time.
I'm sure that'd be a special kind of deed, but anyways.
Yeah, there is a specialty deed for it. There's an Escheat deed for it.
Oh, okay, cool deal.
You don't need to know that for the test, but there is a specialty type.
Just thinking.
It makes it clear why it's being transferred to the state of North Carolina. And so Aloysia said, if the state takes over a property and it's later discussed, they ain't no takesies backsies when it comes to the state of North Carolina. They will tell you that their process is designed to locate all heirs, and if the heirs don't come forward during that period of time, the state auctions the property. That's it. It's over. It's too late. So I always tell people it's worth, if you haven't done it, you can go to the North Carolina state, comptroller's website and check to see if you have unclaimed property. There's an unclaimed property website. And so in case you happen to have someone there, if they're looking for you, it would come up on that website. I had actually a refund from the registrar's office at UNC from when I was in school 20 years ago for like $122 that was on the unclaimed property website. And I think that when I found it, it was like 6 months away from being forfeited to the state. So, you know, it's worth going to check every year or so at I think it's nccash.com. I think it's actually got a key website name. Is it nccash.com?
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. And you can check to see if you have unclaimed property that
sounds like a website I'd get a virus on.
that they're looking for you to give you this property. So
I believe it would be .gov, not .com.
Is it .gov, nccash.gov? Yeah, I can't remember the exact website, but it's something like that. Another example of controlling land use is the subdivision regulations. The process of subdividing land. Now, this is another word you're going to have to redefine in your brain.
Yeah.
A subdivision is not 50 houses in a neighborhood. That's a neighborhood. It may also be a subdivision, but the truth is, if there's 50 houses in a neighborhood, it's probably several subdivisions. A subdivision is a single plat map. How many of you all remember that plat map that I put up of my street where I showed you the easement for the pedestrian crosswalk right there?
Yes.
And there was like maybe 15 lots on that plat map. That map is the subdivision. A subdivision is a plat map. A plat map is a subdivision. So if you pull into a neighborhood and there are 100 homes in Happy Meadows. The sign says Happy Meadows and there's 100 houses in there. But those 100 lots are recorded on 5 plat maps. How many actual subdivisions are there in there?
5.
There are 5. Does everybody see the difference there? The state refers to a subdivision as the lots on one plat map. So therefore, if we are dividing one lot into 2 and we record a plat map, guess what we've created?
A subdivision.
A subdivision, right? That is a subdivision. One map, one subdivision.
You remember we were talking about, why do I love easements? We were talking about appurtenant easements and you had that line down the middle, that would be a subdivision if the land was owned by one person in the beginning.
Anytime you take one bigger piece of land and you start putting property lines and dividing it into lots, that is a subdivision. So why don't I do this? Why don't I pull up that plat map? Because I can back up to it, I think, here. Let me find it real quickly and see if I can go back and pull it up.
You want me to?
It can be a bunch of properties, but can it just be like you take your property and divide it into 2 because you're going to give your kids part of it?
That is it exactly. It
I think that's
doesn't
so cool.
require a number of lots. I've got it right here. I've got
Cool.
it right here. Let me change my share here real quickly, and then I can show it to you. So when you look at this map right here, which is and you notice in the right hand side, it says final plat. Does everybody see that down on the right hand side where it says final plat right there? Right?
Yes. I'll point to it.
So there's only, just counting, I only see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Why is my battery running low? I should be plugged in. I only see 18 lots on that map. The thing is, if you came in my quote unquote neighborhood, you would see a lot more than 18 houses. What that means is that the other houses are on a different plat map, which means technically they're in a different what?
Subdivision.
Subdivision. Because the subdivision is the plat map. Does that make sense for everybody?
So in other words, this was all one tract of land and it got subdivided.
That's exactly right. That was all one piece of property, and this map is subdividing that property into smaller pieces of property. And if you look down in the right-hand side down there, where it says McDonald Woods subdivision phase 2, section 5, that's where you get into, there's a McDonald Woods subdivision phase 2, section 4, phase 2, section 3, phase 2, section 2, and each one of them is going to be a separate what?
Subdivision.
A separate subdivision on a separate map. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
And hold on to that, because he'll get into something really important on the next slide.
So when you talk about creating subdivisions, really what you're talking about is just creating a plat map. You're taking one piece of land and dividing it into more than one piece. In this case, we divided that land into, I don't know, 16 pieces. We took one big piece of land, we divided it into 16 pieces. Could we be taking one piece of land and divide it into 2 pieces though? Would that also be a subdivision?
Yes.
Yes. Anytime you end up with, you start with one lot and you end up with more than one lot, you created a subdivision. And the only way to do that is by filing what that thing is called, which is a what? What is that map called?
Plat map.
A plat map. Now, let's talk about that plat map. There's actually 2 versions of that plat map. There is the preliminary version of that plat map, and then there is the what?
Final
Version of that plat map. And folks, if you notice, it says both of them have to be what at the county courthouse?
Recorded.
Recorded. Here's the difference between the 2. The preliminary one is, this is what we plan to do. What do you think the final one is?
What we did.
This is what we did.
Done.
So if a developer wanted to say, map out new lots, but they were still figuring out where they were placing their easements, should they have a preliminary plat map recorded or a final plat map recorded? What do y'all think?
Preliminary.
Because
Can you restate that?
if they were still mapping out easements, if they were still making changes, would they want to record a preliminary version of the plat map or a final version of the plat map?
Preliminary.
Preliminary. What do you think the word final means, folks?
It's final.
Done.
It means no more what?
Changes.
More changes.
No more changes. Go back and look at this plat map of my subdivision. What does it say down there in the bottom right-hand corner?
Final.
Final plat map. That's it. No more what is going to happen on those lots once this document got recorded at the county courthouse.
Changes.
No more
Subdivisions.
changes. No more easements, no more lot line movements, no nothing. This is the final version of the plat map. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Now, I've had people say, so does that mean I couldn't divide one of these lots? Sure you could, but you'd be creating an entirely new subdivision. If you wanted to take lot number 160 and cut it into 3 lots, you could do that, but you'd have to record a whole new what?
Plat map.
Plat map that just shows what used to be lot number 160 now divided into 3 lots that are their own subdivision. Does that make sense for everybody?
And that example is depending on if the use controls of the land allows you to do that.
Well, that's right. And then you'd have to check to see, are the lots big enough? Am I within the rules? Can I do that? All those things come into, but are we starting to see the connection between the plat map and the subdivision? Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Because
Yes, and when you get done, I have a question.
So here's the reason we require this plat map. We need to tell the world, this is now what this lot looks like. It used to look like this. It used to be one big piece of property. And now we have created a bunch of small lots where there used to be one big one. That's what the plat map is for. Okay. Now in North Carolina, filing the preliminary plat map is step 1 in creating the subdivision. You don't have a subdivision until you file the preliminary plat map. I cannot stress enough that those lots do not exist until you go to the courthouse and record the preliminary version of the plat map. So now I want you to apply this to a test question. Patty is a licensed real estate broker in North Carolina who works for a developer who has plans to develop a new construction subdivision. They have not yet recorded the preliminary plat map, and Patty meets with a buyer who wants to place a deposit on lot number 120. Can Patty accept the deposit and write the purchase contract for lot number 120 for this buyer? No, because lot number 120 doesn't what?
Exist.
Doesn't exist. There is no such thing as, because here's the thing, folks, when you say lot number 120, you're saying lot number 120 on the plat map. That's what you're actually referring to. Does that make sense? But does everybody see the connection there?
Yeah.
You can't take a deposit for lot number 120 on a map that doesn't exist. So step number 1, if you're asked a test question, get this process in your brain. Step number 1 is going to be go record the preliminary version of the plat map, because now we can start to market those lots. Does that make sense for everybody? Now we actually have something we can sell. We can say, yeah, I think of it this way. It's like being able to take orders on a car. You can't go to the Mercedes dealership and place an order on a 2035 Mercedes GLS because they have no idea what a 2035 Mercedes GLS is going to look like. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
But you can place an order on a 2022 one because they know what that's going to be. It's already been built. They already have plans for it. So you can write a contract. You can take a deposit on a lot that has a preliminary plat map recorded. But even still, You can't take their money and transfer ownership of that property. You can't go and file a deed on that property until what has happened to the preliminary version of the plat map.
It's first been recorded.
It's been changed to a final version. Does that make sense for
So-
everybody?
Yes, and also one of my favorite things that I ever connected and realized with this was how you had mentioned going back to the different phases of plat maps that are recorded is the exact reason why they do neighborhoods in phases.
That's exactly right. Because would it be tough to try to finalize a plat map with 100 lots on it, to know exactly where you were going to put every easement, every lot line for 100 lots at one time? Would that be really tough?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So by doing these,
Adding covenants.
So adding covenants to that much. So by doing these in smaller phases, what we are essentially allowing the developer to do is limit how many lots they're having to deal with at one time.
Yeah, and also too, like if they had recorded all 100 houses and something came up, they could never go back and change it if they did
Can't
that.
make a change. That's exactly right. And so it just doesn't make sense from their perspective. But make sure you understand the process. Preliminary plat map, and that allows to start marketing. So we can take a deposit, we can write a contract, we can do all those things, but only after we've recorded what? Preliminary plat map. Okay, so now can we start building the house? Can we? We've written a contract. Can we start building the house on that property, even just with a preliminary plat map?
No.
Yes.
No.
Yes. Yes.
You can build it.
We
You can
can
build it.
start building it. There's only one
can't-
thing that can't happen, folks, and this is why I have to drag you through the mud, because you answer from assumptions rather than the data that is staring you in the face. We can start building the house. We can finish the house, but we cannot do the last step. What can that new owner not do until the final plat map is recorded? They cannot go
Do the
down to the
deed.
county courthouse and record a deed on one of
Become
those
the new
lots.
owner.
We
Connect
cannot
that.
transfer ownership of that land, of that lot, until the plat map has been finalized.
Just to hound that in a little bit further, take step number 2. It says contracts can now be written. Deposits can be taken on lots. If you're writing a contract, you're writing a contract to build a house. There is nothing saying that the other half of that party to the contract can't start fulfilling their promise, start building the house. So
And so let
that's
me
how
ask
I
y'all
connect
something.
it.
Do you think builders want to keep these preliminary as long as they can in case they need to be making changes during the development process?
Absolutely.
Yes. When do you think they record the final plat map first, folks? When do you think they record the final plat map?
When they're ready to close on the first house.
First house. When the first
Love
one
it.
is done and finished, and the day before they're ready to close on the first one, that's what, because they're going to keep that plat map preliminary as long as they possibly can. Does that make sense for everybody?
So
Because-
there's one. Go ahead.
As long as it's preliminary, they can still come back and make changes if they need to. But as soon as they lock it in as a final plat map, so let's say they've written contracts on 10 houses and they're building all 10 of them, and they finally finish number 1 and they're ready to close tomorrow on number 1. That's when they're going to go file the final plat map. Because they can't close on that one tomorrow until they finalize the plat map for the whole subdivision.
Now, there's one things that I've never been able to answer if somebody asks me in practice questions. When are the covenants attached to the land at that point?
When the preliminary plat map is recorded.
Drives me crazy. When the preliminary
Usually
plat
what the covenants are they don't have to be, that's not a requirement, but usually when the preliminary plat map is recorded, that's when you would attach the covenants.
Because it's a recorded document. Okay.
Because you're already down there doing the recording, that's an opportune time to do it. It can be done.
It doesn't sit well with me.
It can be done anytime, but that's the most common one.
Okay, I'm just gonna say typically.
Yeah. How do we all feel about this timeline? Are we all good on that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. One of the most important disclosures that we make as real estate brokers is the status of streets. Are the streets within a subdivision publicly owned, or are they privately owned? That is one of the most important disclosures that we are tasked with making. I will tell you this, folks, do not operate from assumption. I want you all to look out the window right now, wherever you are. I want you to look at the street. And then I want you to ask yourself this question: is that a public street or is that a private street? And then I want you just to I want you to put in the chat what your answer is. I want you to look out the window at your street, and I want you to put in the chat whether that's a publicly owned street, owned by the city, owned by the state, or if it's a privately owned street.
It's a private.
Private.
And now, every single one of you who put an answer in the chat, I want you to slap yourself as hard as you possibly can, because you don't know the answer to that question. And you just made the cardinal mistake of a real estate broker in North Carolina. You don't ever answer that question without checking and verifying with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, is that street at that particular location public or private? You must verify it every single time when you market a property, every time. Because the truth is, it could be a public street on one end and a private street right in front of where your property that you're listing is located. And here's why that's important, folks. If it is a private street, who is responsible for the cost of all maintenance associated with that street?
Owners.
The owner.
The property owners on either side of that street. And that can be thousands of dollars, easily thousands of dollars. So what do you always do when somebody asks you if it's a public or private street?
Verify it.
You
I'll
verify.
look into that.
You verify, you check. Listen, there is no other way. I know that there are signs that say private street. You can't trust them. I know there are signs that don't say private street. You can't trust those either. I've had people say, oh, well, I know mine's a public street because it's got a state road number on the sign. Folks, there are right now in North Carolina over 10,000 roadways with state road numbers that are private roads. 10,000 of them. You cannot know without checking. So how are they going to ask that on the test? Number one, you always check. Number two, this is the bullet point they're going to be looking for if I had to guess on the test. The streets are always private when they're first built. So who's going to be probably building the streets in a new subdivision and a new development? Who's going to be tasked with constructing them?
Developer builder.
The developer builder. That's exactly right. At that point in time, are they private streets or public streets when the builder developer is building them?
Private.
They are private. The builder developer will usually ask the local government or state government to take them over. That is called dedication. That is step one. Dedication. However, that does not mean they are public streets. We have to also have step two, which is acceptance. The state can reject them, folks, and they often do reject them. So if you get a test question where it says the streets in a subdivision have been dedicated by GRI builders, what is the status of the streets? And the only thing they say is the streets in the subdivision have been dedicated to public use by GRI builders. What's the status of the streets, folks? Are they public or private?
Private.
They are private because they only gave you half of the process. You've got to see that they have both been dedicated and what?
Accepted.
And accepted. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
This is such a simple concept that I feel like people continuously overcomplicate. It's such a two-step process. And I just feel like people get it so confused.
So the analogy I always think of in my brain, this is like somebody who gives you a puppy. Just because they give you the puppy doesn't mean you have to accept the puppy. I mean, you ever had somebody bring you a gift and you're like, I don't want that. That's too much work. I don't want the puppy, right? And so the state of North Carolina is not obligated to accept these streets. And if they don't want them, if they don't want the cost of maintaining them, if they don't think they're constructed up to their standards, they will reject them. And when they reject them, they remain private roadways. Okay.
Which is why my favorite example, developers will wait till, you know what I'm going for. You explain it better.
So in most, how many of you have ever been in a new construction subdivision and all of the drains stick up about an inch out of the pavement, all the curbs are about an inch higher than the pavement, and you're like, why in the world did they do this? Let me tell you why they did that. They plan to dedicate these to the state of North Carolina. They plan to ask the state of North Carolina to take them over, but the state is very persnickety when you ask them to take over a roadway. They want them to be perfect. So here's what the developer builder will do. They will pave the streets, but they will leave the top 1 inch of asphalt off so that as they continue to build a neighborhood, if the streets get messed up, if they get cracked, if they get, whatever from all the heavy construction equipment, it doesn't matter, because what are they going to do at the end?
They're going to come through.
They're going to come through and put that final pretty finishing coat on it right before who shows up to look at it?
The state.
The state. That's exactly right. They're going to contact the state and they're going to say, okay, we would like to dedicate these streets to you. When are you going to be here? Well, we'll be there next Thursday. Okay. On Wednesday, that's when they have the asphalt company out there putting down that final coat of asphalt, because they want it to look perfect, because the developer wants them to be public, because as soon as they're public, who doesn't have to maintain them anymore?
The
developers. And so they will, that's why they do that. That's why that is a thing that when you see that happening, what they're waiting for is for that day when the state is coming in to inspect them. And right before that, they'll put that final pretty coat right on top in hope that the state inspector doesn't reject them.
And one other thing that go ahead.
I have a question. If the state doesn't accept it, right, and then the homeowners are all responsible for it, does the builder provide the road maintenance agreement, or do they have to?
Well, that's where we get into ugly territory. A good, responsible developer will, at that point, create like a road maintenance agreement and get everybody to sign off on it. An irresponsible developer will disappear into the night and never tell anybody that the streets were not accepted by the state. They'll simply leave, because what they know is that the homeowners probably won't follow up, and they know that the streets will be fine for many years to come, and problems won't crop up until they are long gone and out of the picture. And then that leaves the homeowners with a big bill down the road when the streets do start to fall apart, because that's what happens. What happens is you build the neighborhoods and the streets are fine. 20 years after the neighborhood's built, you got potholes everywhere, and people in the neighborhood start to call the city and complain and say, you need to get out here and fix these potholes. And the city's like, we were about to call you and tell you need to fix those potholes because you're tearing up our cars when we drive through there. And that's your street. And so that's when it becomes a problem. And that's why, as a real estate agent, we just don't trust. We contact the Department of Transportation. As a matter of fact, and I'm hoping it goes live next year, the North Carolina Association of Realtors has actually volunteered and offered to fund for the North Carolina Department of Transportation a database that will be easily searchable by realtors in the state of publicly maintained roadways, so that we can actually go in and put in like GPS coordinates, and it'll tell us instantly whether that's a public roadway or a private roadway. So we don't have to reach out individually to the Department of Transportation every time.
Very, very cool. I have one fun fact that from one of our previous classes and one question. So if a neighborhood has a gate in the front of it and the public can't use it, it's a private.
Those are private streets for sure.
Private streets. So I thought that was really cool. And then also, question, the disclosure law doesn't, I don't want to say doesn't apply, but doesn't necessarily fall on the builders, correct?
Well, it does and it doesn't, but we're focusing on what our responsibility is here. So, because that's where the test is going to focus. Yeah.
Got it.
So if you see a street that has potholes and it's been like that for a long time and the asphalt is all messed up, would that fall into what you just said? It's private and it never became public?
No, I would not. It could, but I wouldn't make that assumption without contacting the Department of Transportation and verifying first. That'd be step one, is verify what the status is. And then once you verify the status, then you can start to figure out who would be responsible for that maintenance and that repair.
Yeah, which, that's a really good point, Howard. I don't think I would necessarily put a blanket statement saying if there's a pothole, it must be private. Because when I drive on 540, I know where them potholes
There
are.
are plenty of publicly maintained roads that are in rough shape. That's for sure.
Right.
I know how to avoid them.
And listen, not every subdivision will want their streets to be publicly maintained. You brought up one of the classic examples, gated communities. They don't want their streets to be publicly maintained because they want to be able to keep people out. So but that's expensive. Like in the case of Governor's Club in Chapel Hill. Governor's Club is a neighborhood that has extensive private roadways within it. It's a huge gated golf community. Beautiful. It's breathtakingly beautiful. Yeah. Folks, just to give you an idea of the cost of maintaining private roadways, there is a separate annual homeowners assessment for every home in that neighborhood every year, just for the streets, of $4,800 per home per year, just for the private street maintenance. That doesn't even count their other HOA dues. And if you want to join and play golf at the country club and all that stuff, that's just for the streets.
But they have some beautiful roads out there, maintained well.
It's gorgeous.
Now, my parents live down in Sanford, actually. My mom and stepdad, and they live in a private community, but man, the cost of the roads are like a fraction of that.
Right. And my parents also have private roadways in their neighborhood, and they went down this path about 5 years ago. The homeowners had decided, we want to have the state take over the road maintenance. And I'll tell you what prompted it. They were about to have to repave all the streets in the neighborhood. And they thought, well, we're going to have to pay for this no matter what, because the state's not going to take it over until we repave it. But maybe this will be the last time we have to repave them, because if we can repave them now and then get the state to come in here, they might take them over and we never have to pay for this again. Right. So that was the thought process. So they went through the process, and the state sent their inspector out there, and the inspector is, going through and looking at all the streets and making notes for them. Well, my parents live in a neighborhood with all a bunch of old retired people. It's not a 55 and up community. It just so happens that's all that lives there on Lake Gaston in this neighborhood. And my dad and all those old men are being nosy as hell, following the state inspector around on their golf carts. So they're all riding around, drinking beers, watching him do his job. And he looks at them after about an hour of this, and he says, I bet y'all gonna miss those golf carts. And they all start looking at each other going, what do you mean we're gonna miss the golf carts? He said, you can't drive a golf cart on a publicly maintained roadway. Folks, that ended the whole plan about the streets becoming public right there. They were like, we want the golf cart. We need the drunk mobiles around here. No, these will be private. We'll just keep them private. So not every neighborhood is going to want them to be publicly maintained. So that's why you always have to check. You really do.
That's funny.
And just to repeat what you said, we checked with the North Carolina DOT.
Yep. Contact the Department of Transportation. Exactly.
Oh.
Yep. Covenants, which Seth asked the question about earlier. So now we have finally moved out of public land use restrictions, because I know we want to keep it categorized, and we are moving into private land use restrictions.
Right in the middle.
Everything else that we've talked about in this chapter is public. Zoning, public, enforced by the government, right? Rules that come from the government, rules that are enforced by the government. Building codes, rules that come from the government, rules that are enforced by the government. Subdivision rules, rules that come from the government, rules that are enforced by the government. Those are, Colin, it's not Sleepy Hollow, no, it's Timber Creek. Those are all government restrictions that are enforced by the government. These now are private land use controls, covenants. Sometimes they are referred to as CCRs. Sometimes they are referred to as restrictive covenants. They have all kinds of names that you might see them referred to, but they are private restrictions. And Seth did ask this question earlier. What's the most common time that we apply the covenants to the property, to these individual properties? When we file the plat map. At the time the plat map is created and filed, that's the most common time for a developer to place these restrictions. It is important to remember that covenants, when they are placed, at the time they are placed, can pretty much do anything and limit anything as long as they do not violate the law at that point in time. We have to make sure that any covenants that, as of the time the covenants are placed on the property, they don't violate the law. Big test question right here. This is coming as a test question and people miss it. I don't care how much I say it or scream it. I've never quite figured out how to get it fixed for people. This is one of those things that people miss. Covenants are not enforced by the government. Don't call the police if somebody's violating the covenants. Don't go to the planning and zoning office if somebody's violating the covenants. Don't file a complaint with the city if somebody's violating the covenants. Those are all examples of government. Covenants, folks, are not government rules. Who placed the covenants there?
Neighbor.
Private landowners.
The owner of the property. So who enforces?
Could be a builder.
Which at that point was probably the builder developer, but still an owner of the property, right?
Right.
So whose job from that point forward forevermore is it to enforce the covenants?
Other property
The
owners.
other owners.
Other owners that are all subject to those rules. They have to enforce the rules on each other. Because remember, anytime you created a subdivision, you created at least how many lots?
2 or more.
At least two
right?
or more. Yeah.
So if the subdivision only has 2 lots, guess who can police those 2 lots? Each other. If the subdivision has 10 lots, so if we go back to this plat map over here, the covenants that are in this subdivision, the only people that can enforce them are the people who own one of these lots. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Somebody who owns a lot that is not on this plat map cannot enforce these covenants on one of these homeowners. It has to be somebody who's on the same plat map because that's what the law defines as the same subdivision. Does that make sense for everybody?
Got it.
So it's got to be one of your nosy neighbors. That's where
and Travis,
enforcement comes from.
I really just want to take one more second to let everybody, let's put a very, very hard line in where we just came from and where we're at now. Because as Travis said, this is something that people do commonly get wrong. You've got to be able to make the distinction of what is government. So just kind of tying together, we just went through subdivision rules and regulations. That is something the city sets forth for any subdivision that's created. Now we're moving into those private rules that owners, builders are going to attach to those subdivisions that they create. Those builders, those owners are subject to the rules that the city places for subdivisions. But going forward, they're going to attach any private use restrictions to that property. The police do not enforce those.
That's right. The police don't enforce your covenants, right? And your neighbors don't enforce the laws. The police are there to enforce the laws. The city is there to enforce the laws, but your neighbors are there to enforce the restrictions that only matter to you as neighbors. And so how does that look? Does your nosy neighbor across the street show up with a shotgun at your front door and tell you to put your garbage can inside? What does that enforcement look like? Hopefully not the shotgun. Okay.
I love it, Sierra.
The result is, this is the answer they're going to be looking for on a test. how do two parties settle a dispute between each other? If you have two private homeowners and one of them is saying you are violating rules that we are both supposed to be following, the recourse for them is to file a lawsuit. They sue each other. And so they go to court and they essentially ask a judge to settle the dispute. I think people confuse that with government enforcement. That's not government enforcement. Courts are there to settle private disputes, right? That's what civil court is. This is not criminal court. This is civil court. And civil courts are there to settle private disputes between people. And so that's where the lawsuit comes in. The other thing I think that people miss on the test is they want to answer badly that it's going to be the big bad HOA who comes in and enforces these things. Folks, it doesn't need to be an HOA. Could it be an HOA? Sure. HOA, though, is just short for Homeowners Association, which, of course, is an association of who?
The homeowners.
The homeowners. So ultimately, if the neighborhood doesn't have an HOA, can the covenant still be enforced by the neighbors on each other? What do y'all think?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
By
Absolutely.
how many neighbors? How many does it take?
One.
One.
That's all it takes. One filing a lawsuit against the others. That's what it would take in my neighborhood, for example. There is no HOA. There is no formal group. We don't pay dues. There isn't, but there is a set of covenants that was recorded in 1979. If somebody was to violate those, as a matter of fact, somebody down the street from me right now is violating one of the covenants. It says on our covenants, you cannot have a basically a camper on your property that somebody is utilizing. Well, he has his camper in the driveway, and I don't know who sleeps out there. I don't know if it's him when he gets in trouble with his wife or what happens. But every once in a while, you walk by there and the slide outs are out, and somebody is clearly in there at night. And I don't know if it's like they have a guest that comes over like once a month or something, or if he just gets in the doghouse and he goes and sleeps in the camper. Technically, that violates the covenants. Could I take him and sue him in Wake County Civil Court to try to enforce that covenant if I wanted to?
Yes.
Yes.
But it would be you versus a pub. Yeah.
That's right. It would be me. I can't, if I called the town of Cary to the police and said, the guy's sleeping in the camper, they're going to look at me and be like, so what do you want us to do about it?
Do something about it.
That's not our rule, So I just want to make sure you're really clear understanding of there's a differentiation between who enforces which set of rules. Are we all okay with that?
Yes.
There was one thing that I really wanted to mention before we moved on that okay, so you remember how we were talking about ownership and how we can have fee simple absolute, which means no new restrictions have been attached to the property.
Right.
This kind of would fall along those same lines of
Yes.
attaching restrictions.
Yes, for sure.
Private covenants.
That's right. These are covenants that were attached by some previous grantor, usually the developer, at some point in time, and they become a pertinent to the property.
Yeah, I have a dumb and stupid question. Previous slide, please. Okay, you had, oh no, the covenant. Yeah, okay. You say here, let me see what, okay. The covenant would be stopped by any other owner in the same subdivision. So my dumb question is, suppose some guy on a different plat map in a different subdivision had a problem with something that I have. Can he sue me?
No.
Okay.
No.
That's a good question.
It's a great question. That's not a stupid question at all. This is internal enforcement.
Okay.
Here's what would happen if somebody who owned property in a different subdivision filed a lawsuit to force the covenants against you. Their lawsuit would be dismissed because they don't have standing to file the lawsuit. They don't have the right to file that lawsuit.
Okay.
It has to be once. So when you go back and look at this plat map, it's a great question. If lot number 160 is violating the covenant, it's got to be one of these other lot owners right here to file a lawsuit against lot number 160.
Okay.
That's exactly a key point that was in my mind too. So thank you, Howard.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's got to be somebody on the same plat map. And that's why it is this interior sort of enforcement. We enforce the rules on each other. The idea here is the rules impact everybody equally. So it's up to everybody to hold each other accountable.
And yes, Rachel,
in that group.
Typically it would be the only way to enforce it would take somebody to court, or if the in real life situation, the enforcement was transferred to an HOA, they could send
Right.
some
Well,
notices
and that's why
stuff.
now you can see, because it's so crazy to think about taking your neighbor down the street to court because they sleep in the camper once a month. That's why so many of these neighborhoods choose to create an HOA, because they choose to kind of bond together as a group, and let's pay somebody to be the neighborhood police, right?
Mediator,
right.
police.
So that none of us have to individually do it. But ultimately the power of the HOA only comes from the individual homeowners.
Right, which is in my mind. When you get that letter, it's really Karen across the street.
That's it. It's Karen across the street who's sending you the letter. It's not, I mean, the HOA is just your neighbors. That's all it is. Or some group, some management company that your neighbors hired to come after you, you know?
Absolutely. You know, just a quick example, and I know we're getting a little in depth on something, but it's my mom and my stepdad had actually had one tire off of the concrete on the grass, and they got a letter for it.
There you go.
It couldn't be on the grass.
Because clearly they are absolute scourges on the neighborhood, and they must be taken out at all costs.
And you know, it's them annoying ones who monitor everything in the neighborhood, but
that brings up the great point of why is it so important for us to make sure buyers are aware of the covenants before they make an offer to purchase a property, because they are subjecting themselves to that treatment. They are subjecting themselves to that enforcement.
And we're not sitting here bashing on covenants, of course. Like, you know, the main thing that they're supposed to do is protect property values. So, just a good point about that. And then also, Travis, I know we are getting way in depth on this, but I really just want to ask for connection purposes. So if the builder developer was to attach these covenants to the property when the plat map is recorded, they're transferring fee simple to feasible?
The builder developer would be fee simple to feasible.
Initially.
And then the ones after that would be fee simple absolute, because they wouldn't be adding any new restrictions. They would just be passing along the existing restrictions.
Okay. Got it.
But yes, the builder developer would be doing fee simple to feasible, because they would be placing restrictions that one time.
I think what's important for me about these covenants is that, you know, you see those people that have 15 cars in their driveway and in various places of repair. That's such a blight on the community that you really want that to not happen.
Well, that's exactly right. If you've seen, the unfortunate reality is, if you see what happens sometimes when you don't have them, then that alternative is worse than the pain of putting up with them. You know, there's definitely a push and pull there for sure. Okay. So, and I think so too, some are to tie it together. And by the way, specifically, Seth, of the fee simple to feasible, it would be fee simple subject to a condition. Because the developer is telling future owners what they cannot do with the property.
Yeah. I think that is really cool. But just tying that back, it's protecting the property values.
That's the idea. So we've talked about this. We mentioned this earlier. Land often, almost always, has both public and private controls. As far from an enforcement standpoint, neither one of them has more importance than the other, because it is simply two different masters. You have the government to enforce the public controls, and you have your neighbors to enforce the private controls. What that means from a practical standpoint for the owner of the property is that they have to follow both sets of rules, because you can't ask for relief from either one. If you go to your neighbors, they can't give you relief from the city's rules. And if you go to the city, they can't give you relief from your neighbor's rules. Does that make sense for everybody? And so ultimately the property owner has to figure out how they can use the property and satisfy all the rules, which means apply all the rules. So that means if there is some differentiation between the rules, figure out which one is the more strict, and you will be in compliance with both of them. So as an example, the city zoning ordinances say any fence up to 6 feet tall. The covenants say only fences constructed of wood no more than 4 feet tall. If you want to be in compliance with both sets of rules, what kind of fence can you put up?
Up to 4 feet wooden.
4 feet.
Wood up to 4 feet, because in that case, the covenants are the more strict of the two. Does that make sense for everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And it's not because they're covenants, it's just because they're the more strict in that case. If the zoning was more strict, as an example, if the covenants say, you can park 2 cars in the street, but the city says no parking on the street, what's the answer?
No parking.
No parking on the street.
No parking on the street, because you're not going to violate either set of rules. And so you always take the more strict of the two, and that's the one that has to be followed in any given situation to make sure you stay in compliance with all of them.
And just a quick side note, I think it's very important to associate which word between zoning and covenants apply to public versus private. So definitely get those terms connected.
Zoning, public; covenants, private, right?
Mhm.
Sure. Covenants, neighbors; zoning, government.
Yes.
When we have these covenants, because they are attached by previous owners, there's a lot of things that could be covered in those covenants that might have been legal at the time they were attached, but would no longer be legal by today's standards. A really unfortunate but common example of this are covenants that have discriminatory language in them, especially in residential situations that say, properties can only be purchased by, white persons. Properties cannot be purchased by colored people. Those, all that kind of offensive, grotesque, make your stomach turn stuff existed. We cannot deny its existence. And because a lot of it, unfortunately, made its way into restrictive covenants that were placed against these properties, and because covenants are pertinent, and we know what that word means, it means they stay attached for how long?
Forever.
Forever.
You're going to still see them. And it makes me angry that you're going to still see them, but that doesn't change the fact that you're going to see them. And so when you do, you need to know how to deal with them, how to explain them to a consumer. And the way you explain them is, if there are covenants that are placed against the property that would violate current law, then they are not to be followed. They are not to be enforced. They are unenforceable. In essence, any covenants which were placed at the time and were legal, but since then have become illegal, are ignored. They are not followed. And that's the answer they'd be looking for in a test. Now, it's not only the discriminatory things. There are plenty of other examples I could point out to you of silly things, but that's the one that comes up the most commonly. I'll give you another example of one. It was very common in the late 70s through mid 80s, late 80s, to see covenants that said no satellite dishes. How many of you remember what satellite dishes looked like about 1985 or so?
Gigantic.
It was big.
From space.
11 or 12 feet across, right? And people did not want their neighbors to have that. And they didn't want to stare at somebody's satellite dish staring them back across the backyard because the things were huge. And so a lot of developers started putting covenants in that said no satellite dishes. Those covenants are illegal today, folks. And the reason they're illegal is there was a tiny little company that you've probably never heard of called DirecTV, who filed a federal lawsuit when they created an 18-inch satellite dish, and they took it all the way to the United States Supreme Court and said that that was an unfair infringement on the right to freedom of expression and free speech. And the United States Supreme Court agreed with DirecTV and said that private covenants could not restrict the use of communications by satellite dish. And so that's how DirecTV, because up to that point in time, if you had covenants that said no satellite dishes, even though they were intended for the big 12-foot ones, you couldn't get a DirecTV dish at your house. And so DirecTV fought that all the way to the Supreme Court and they won. And so any covenants that reference satellite dishes are unenforceable. Just as an example, it's not just the discriminatory things, but unfortunately the discriminatory ones are probably the most common that you'll run across. Is everybody okay with that? Don't enforce the ones that would violate current law.
Question. If the, in the satellite dish example, why did they go after free speech and not after restraint of trade?
I don't know, but that was the argument was based around speech and communication and yeah.
I don't need to go there, but there I am.
I don't know, but they won.
We all do it.
Whatever they found the merits worked, I guess. What is our duty to disclose? We have an absolute duty to disclose everything we reasonably could know about a property that we are selling. When we are representing people in these transactions, the standard that applied to us is called the reasonableness standard. You don't need to know that for the test. But basically what they ask is, what would an agent who works in this kind of area of real estate reasonably be expected to know? And so what that means is you're going to have to be knowledgeable about the things you do. If you don't know commercial real estate, don't just jump your feet into a commercial transaction, because there are going to be things that you would be expected to know that you probably won't know. So even though you have the licensure to do it, doesn't mean you're qualified necessarily. And so make sure that you are knowledgeable in whatever areas of real estate you agree to represent people, because you are going to be held to this standard of, well, what are other reasonably knowledgeable licensees? So here's the thing. Let's say you help somebody buy a building that they want to operate as a bar, and you find out after the fact that the zoning doesn't allow them to operate it as a bar. They're going to file a complaint with the real estate commission. And the real estate commission is going to look at you and go, well, why didn't you tell them it couldn't be used as a bar? And you're going to say, well, I don't know. All I've ever sold is houses. I never sold a commercial property before. Do you think the real estate commission would find that most people who represented commercial clients would understand they needed to check the zoning to see if what their client wanted to do was allowed? What do y'all think the real estate commission would say about that?
Zoning.
They would say, dummy, yes, you should have known. And so be careful to make sure that you are as knowledgeable as you reasonably can be, because we do have a duty to disclose these items, these controls that are in place about the property.
Travis.
Yes.
What if you are operating under a BIC? Again, something went wrong in the transaction. You didn't necessarily know because you're new to this whole world of real estate. Would that BIC also be held accountable by the North Carolina Real Estate Commission?
That is a great question. The answer to that is most likely yes. Most likely, generally speaking, the broker in charge is responsible for all of the brokerage activities. And we're going to talk about a broker in charge much more so as we move forward, and who they are and what functions they provide. But supervision of the brokerage duties is definitely one of those responsibilities. And so what the Real Estate Commission would probably say there is, the broker in charge would have some responsibility for allowing somebody who didn't have that knowledge to represent that client in that transaction. That the broker in charge should probably recognize Taj is new. She's only done residential transactions. And here she's doing this transaction where somebody's trying to buy, a 24-bay car wash. She's probably not going to know all the things that go into that. So I need to make sure that we get her some help so that she can advise the client correctly. So yes, most likely the broker in charge would have some responsibility there.
I feel like this might be an important note really fast too. Just that last one on slide number 207, agent's duty to disclose, obtain copies of deed restrictions and protective covenants before the buyers make an offer on the property. So I
that's
did
a great
highlight that in
thing.
red.
I mean, think about it. If somebody is making an offer to purchase this property and spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a property, shouldn't we make every effort to get them a copy of these restrictions before they even make the offer, before they're under contract, before they've invested money in paying deposits and all those kinds of things? I mean, it's not fair to come to a buyer who's already made a $10,000 deposit and say, oh, by the way, here are the 26 things you can't do with the property, right? That's not fair. So
going back to the piano example,
there you go.
They might need to do a home-based business.
She needs to know she can't teach piano lessons in that home before she ever even makes an offer, because likely here's what she would have said. I don't want to buy that house. I don't want to waste my time. I don't want, there's no need.
And so also those covenants are publicly recorded at the county courthouse. Sometimes they're easy to find, sometimes they're a little harder.
Yep.
So anyways.
But it's our job.
I love that chapter.
Yeah. All right, folks. Well, I think we are ready for some lunch. What do y'all think?
Yes, I am.
Which chapter will we be doing after lunch?